Well, I have studied many conspiracy theories in my life, and the absolute worst one I've ever heard is the official version of 9/11. We were told that 19 Muslim fanatics somehow bypassed our $40 billion defense system, hijacked 4 planes simultaneously, causing their transponders to go off almost at the exact same time. We're totally lost from FAA radar, not to mention satellite radar and NORAD radar, made their way to New York and crashed into 2 prominent landmarks, the 2 towers of the World Trade Center, and then another one crashed into the Pentagon, and then another one crashed in Pennsylvania, and all of this under the direction of a Muslim cleric hiding in a cave in Afghanistan with a computer. Now, if that isn't about the craziest conspiracy theory I ever heard, and yet that is what we are expected to accept as the legitimate version of what happened on 9/11. But as anyone who studied the facts knows, there's too many gaps in that whole story. The evidence points to something much larger than that. First, we start with war game exercises. Vigilant Warrior, Vigilant Guardian. For more than a year, no one even knew that these war game exercises were being conducted on the morning of 9/11. And when it began to circulate on the internet, the response seemed to be, this is some sort of internet hoax. And yet, when Richard Clarke, who was then the counterterrorism chief, published his book, he, within 6 pages, talked about the war games exercises. He contacted General Myers of NORAD and said, we have planes hijacked, you have interceptors in the air. And the first thing Myers said was, well, is this real or is this the war games? The FAA had as many as 22 images on their radar screens that were false software images simulating hijacked planes. Our normal interceptors had training ammunition and were off into Canada, off over the Atlantic, here, there, and everywhere. And it was because of these war game exercises that the hijackers were able to penetrate our normal defense system and cause the havoc that they did on 9/11. And yet there's been very little or no mention of this. Why? Because the National Security Agency intercepted a message from Mohammed Atta, who we are told was the leader of the hijacks, the day before, in which he said, the match is about to begin. Tomorrow is 0 hour. Notice he didn't say the jihad or the operation or the attack. He said the match. The games begin tomorrow, and that's 0 hour. Now, if the public in the United States had no idea of these war games, how did the hijackers know to coordinate their attacks with these war game exercises? And there's only one explanation. This was an inside job. They had inside information. And then it just goes on and on from there. The collapse of the World Trade Center was one of the biggest disasters in world history. More firemen were killed than at any other one event. This was the first and only instances of modern skyscrapers that just completely collapsed upon themselves. It was the largest structural failure in history, and yet where was the investigation? They should have had everyone from building contractors and structural engineers and metallurgists and everything else. They should have pored over that evidence for months and months and even years to find out what really happened, to make sure it would never happen again. But this didn't happen. In fact, who investigated it? Was it the New York Fire Department or the New York Police Department? No. Was it the FBI? No, it was FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, which answers directly to the President of the United States. Okay? And what did they do? They employed 26 engineers and then would not even let them look at all the evidence or look at all the buildings involved. And they had to give out a pretty tepid report. Then they took the steel, which should have been studied from hell to breakfast to find out how that could have collapsed even under intense fires, and it was all shipped overseas. Blatant destruction of evidence. But at the key of that, of the World Trade Center, lies not the Twin Towers. There's been too much, hired experts on every side claiming this, that, and the other thing. What you have to look at is Building 7. Building 7 was nestled between the Verizon building, the U.S. Post Office, across the street from the World Trade Center complex, and between Building 5 and 6 was between Building 7 and the Twin Towers. And this was a 47-story steel and concrete structure, and at about 5:20 on the afternoon of September the 11th, no planes hit this building, but it caved in on itself and totally collapsed into its own footprint. So perfectly that it did very little damage to the Verizon building or the U.S. Post Office. Larry Silverstein, the lessor of the World Trade Center, said on public television that he didn't want any more loss of life. He was afraid that there could be a problem. So he told them to pull it. And he stood there while they pulled it. Pulling it is an industry jargon for a controlled demolition. And that's exactly what happened to Building 7. The commander of the New York Fire Department, in talking about Buildings 5 and 6 that were so heavily damaged, said we had to pull them. And they blew down those buildings too. Well, if Building 7 was the result of a controlled demolition, then I think that there's every reason in the world to ask the question, was the towers the result of controlled demolition? The thing that really concerns me, having covered many controlled building demolitions, is that when they blow a building down, there is still huge chunks of concrete everywhere, and they have to go in and break all that up. In the World Trade Center, it was pulverized, nothing but dust and debris everywhere. Something with tremendous pressure was able to pulverize the concrete in those buildings, and you don't have that by a building suddenly toppling down. And I would point you simply to the Windsor Hotel in Madrid, Spain, which in early 2005 burned out of control through a whole weekend for 3 or 4 days, completely gutted the building, had temperatures in excess of 1,000 degrees. Building never collapsed. So there are serious questions that were never addressed by the hand-picked 9/11 Commission. Witnesses have been silenced. The people that I would particularly point to are the maintenance engineers for the North and South Tower, who are on the public record saying that there were multiple explosions in the buildings and explosions underground. Mike Pecoraro was in a 6th-floor sub-basement when the building shook. He and a worker went to the 3rd sub-basement, which was a machine shop, and he said it was destroyed. He said, I'm talking about a 50-ton drill press, just gone. And this was before the building collapsed. What caused the destruction in the basements of the World Trade Center before those buildings collapsed? Nobody's addressed that question. And of course, there's so many questions about the Pentagon that it's not even funny. That we are told that a big Boeing 757 smacked into the Pentagon, folded up like a tube and just roared in there, and then caught fire and burned up with such intensity that there's no wreckage left. And yet I interviewed a survivor, April Gallup, who along with her small child crawled through the hole in the west side of the Pentagon. There's no way she'd be alive today if there were that kind of fires going on and that kind of heat. And the key thing here is, we all know that after every major air disaster, they reconstruct the aircraft. They take every little piece they can find and they go to a hangar and they reassemble it so they can figure out what happened to that aircraft. Show me a picture of the 757 pieced back together from the Pentagon, and I'll shut up about the questions about the Pentagon, but they haven't showed us that and they won't. There's too many unanswered questions. This is a tremendous cover-up that's taken place, and if we are going to continue to call ourselves a free people, we better start demanding some truthful answers.